Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. Well, there was a ceasefire supposedly in effect Sunday. I'm not sure if Israel has violated it yet. Maybe my next guest will know, but we know that they violated the ceasefire in Lebanon repeatedly, and there's been a lot of developments. Most notably, a lawsuit brought on behalf of 5 Palestinian families by an organization called Dawn, and that is against the State Department for not enforcing the Leahy Law, which basically says that we should not give any money or weapons to foreign forces that are doing gross human rights violations. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring in my guest, who is the executive director of Dawn, and we will find out more about this. My guest here is Sarah Leah Whitson. How are you doing tonight, Sarah?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Lauren.
Well, you're welcome. I've been following you for a long time on X, for at least 16 months that this genocide has been going on. And I've really appreciated all your posts. And now this lawsuit, when I found out that you were doing it, I said, oh my gosh, I have to have her on to talk about it. So before we get to the lawsuit, why don't you tell the viewers about Dawn, who started it, what its purpose is, and a little bit about your own background?
Yeah, sure. So Dawn was founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi. That's my dog in the background. That's my husband walking in. Sorry. Um, Jamal Khashoggi founded the organization in the United States in June 2018. He had come to the United States really for political asylum because he was facing repression in Saudi Arabia. 3 months after he founded Dawn, the Saudi government murdered him by luring him to Turkey, to the consulate in Istanbul, where they killed him. I took over Dawn after Jamal's murder, and our organization's mission and focus is to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East. But as a US-based organization, we focus our attention on US policy in the Middle East because that's where we feel we have a responsibility to act. And that's where we hope we can have an actual impact. We think that American policies in support of abusive regimes in the Middle East is bad policy. It's bad for the people of the region. It's bad for America. It's bad for the world. And so that's really what we're focused on trying to change.
Well, you're going to get a chance to repeat that because, hold on a second, I just found out, and this has happened to me before, that I got locked out of Facebook, which is the primary place that I broadcast to, and I had to just reconnect during your entire introduction. So now we are supposedly live on Facebook. I will fix this in the edit, folks. I apologize. But anyway, please tell our viewers, again, this is Sarah Leah Whitson, who is the executive director of Dawn, and Dawn is suing on behalf of 5 Palestinian families, the State Department for not enforcing the Leahy Law, which basically says we cannot give assistance to any foreign forces who are violating human rights, gross violations of human rights. So before we talk about the lawsuit, I'd like to give Sarah an opportunity to introduce herself, her organization, and talk a little bit about her own background in the field of human rights.
Sure. So as I was saying, Dawn was founded in 2018 by the late Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident who had come to the United States, actually a journalist and a former government spokesperson. And he set up Dawn in June 2018, but the Saudi government murdered him in October 2018 by luring him to its consulate in Istanbul. And so I took over the organization in April 2020. It really hadn't been active after Jamal's murder. We work to reform US foreign policy in the Middle East. We think that the best contribution that we can make to human rights and democracy in the Middle East is to get America's fist off the scale of repression, off the scale in favor of the repressive regimes that are terrorizing the people of the region. And so we really work to reform US policy in the Middle East.
And talk about your own background, because you used to be with Human Rights Watch. What kind of work did you do there?
Yeah, before joining Dawn, I was at Human Rights Watch, where I was the executive director of the Middle East and North Africa division for 16 years. We worked across the Middle East, North Africa region, covering human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law in 19 countries around the region. And I have been involved in on the ground investigations in nearly every country in the Middle East.
And how did
And
you
I have spent a
personally,
lot of time in conflict zones in the Middle East,
how did you
unfortunately.
personally get interested in the Middle East of all the regions?
Probably my family history. My mother's Armenian, and we have very close ties to the Middle East. She spent her early childhood in Jerusalem. She was born in a refugee camp in Lebanon and made it to the United States. And so we always had one foot in the Middle East, my mother and her family. And I learned Arabic and got to study in the region. And, I just felt very close to the region.
Great. Now let's talk about the lawsuit itself. Tell me, did you find the Palestinian families or did they find you? And how did this lawsuit come about?
Well, how the lawsuit came about is that my colleagues at Dawn and I have been really involved in various aspects of seeking to enforce the so-called Leahy laws for as long as the law has been around, since 1997. And what we knew in those decades is that the United States has never enforced the Leahy law against Israel. It has never one done what the law requires, which is to stop aid to a military unit implicated in gross violations of human rights. And so we realized that this was a violation of the law and that there was an opportunity to challenge this failure to enforce US law, which is the job of the State Department. It doesn't have options when there's a law that says it must not do something. And realized that the Administrative Procedure Act, if I'm not getting too far in the weeds, is the vehicle with which we can challenge that, because that allows plaintiffs who've been harmed by the failure of the US government to enforce a law to force the government to enforce the law. And typically these are claims brought against the EPA or the FDA, agencies that are responsible for enforcing various laws passed by Congress, but it hadn't been really used before to challenge the failure to not enforce the Leahy law. And so we reached out to communities, our contacts in Palestine, in the United States, telling them that we were interested in finding people who'd been injured by Israel's atrocities in Gaza and in the West Bank, who were interested in being part of this lawsuit. And so these are the families who joined us.
And talk about the involvement of Josh Paul, who famously quit the State Department very early on in this genocide, and the other name in your article, Charles Blaha, which I was not as familiar with. They're integral parts. What are they doing besides just being witnesses to the fact that the Leahy law is not being enforced?
Well, that's why they're working with Dawn and working on this lawsuit and advising and helping provide the evidence and helping us establish the facts based on their inside knowledge in their jobs, which was to enforce the Leahy laws, knowing for decades the way in which they were prevented effectively from enforcing the law by the higher ups, by the secretaries of state over various administrations, most recently under the Biden administration. And so that, coupled with mountains of evidence of Israeli abuses that would have its weapons blocked if it was anywhere else in the world, is why Josh, Paul, and Kabla are working with us because they want to see US law enforced.
Now, talk about these gross violations. I mean, obviously, you're not going to give me every single example because there have probably been hundreds of thousands of them. But what are the categories of the gross violations that we've seen in Gaza since October 8th?
Well, just in Gaza since October 8th, we've seen obviously mass killings, indiscriminate killings, arbitrary detentions without charge. We've seen massive torture. And we've seen perhaps the most serious human rights violation. That's the deprivation of life, liberty, and security by subjecting Palestinians to indiscriminate and deliberate bombing, by subjecting them to starvation and siege, as has been documented by international organizations around the world. These are the grossest violations of human rights. And they are ones which would not have been taking place but for US weapons. And so that's where it comes back to wanting to see our government enforce the law, because our own laws do not want the State Department or anyone else supporting the atrocities, arming the atrocities we're seeing in Gaza or anywhere else in the world. That's what the law says.
Can you talk about places where we have enforced the law?
Sure. The law is really enforced hundreds of thousands of times a year, according to Cobb and Josh, whose job it was to enforce this. So it restricts military assistance from particular units of foreign security forces that the United States is supporting. And so in Mexico, units have been sanctioned. Even in Ukraine, at certain times, units have been sanctioned. Nigeria, units have been sanctioned. I mean, the United States gives weapons military assistance to many, many countries around the world. And so that is a lot of security force units they are vetting. That is why there's just, a regular enforcement of this law. There's a machinery that enforces this law, and it has a purpose. And it works very well, at least in terms of abiding by the law, except when it comes to Israel. That's when our government has chosen never to enforce the law.
Now, don't they even have special rules for the way the Leahy Law is supposed to be applied in Israel that allows them, as I said in my question to my congressman, Chuck Edwards, I got on his telephone town hall last week, where they're allowed to sort of self-identify and, even worse, self-remediate these violations. Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So, on the self-remediation aspect of it, what the law says is that the United States cannot give military assistance to security force units that have been implicated in gross violations of human rights and that are unremediated. So the government has the opportunity to prosecute the bad apple soldier in a unit that, I don't know, killed someone or tortured someone, put them in jail and so forth. And if they show that they've remediated, they can get aid restored. And so this year, for the first time, 5 Israeli military units came close to being sanctioned. It was meant to be some kind of a breakthrough because of the extensive violence by settlers in the West Bank. This had been the Biden administration's mini priority at the beginning of its administration. And so they sort of made it through the special exclusive vetting forum called the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum that is supposed to review gross violations of human rights by Israeli security forces. And in each of those cases, basically, Secretary Blinken personally intervened to bless the security forces as having been remediated, as having addressed the wrongdoing, or in one case where there really was no evidence of any remediation whatsoever, to create a new standard saying that this one battalion that had killed a 78-year-old American Palestinian man was remediated because it was on a pathway to remediation. Just utter nonsense, utter nonsense. It just shows the somersaults the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken personally would make to the world, to the public, to their own staff, to justify not enforcing U.S. law. And it's just such a great disservice.
Yeah, this is the Netza Yehuda battalion you're speaking about?
That's right, the Netza Yehuda battalion, which is a notorious battalion known for having some of the most extremist, violent settler youth in its ranks. These guys have like an ideological zeal squadron going on, and they have been implicated in so many abuses against Palestinians throughout the time that they've been deployed. And yet the only time the State Department even remotely paid attention was when this American Palestinian citizen, 78-year-old man, was killed. And it took tremendous lobbying by American civil society groups and the family of this American Palestinian man to demand redress. That this is why it almost was going to be sanctioned by the US government not to receive military assistance. But even then, Secretary Blinken had to intervene to make stuff up to let him have a pass.
Now, Blinken has some ties to Israel. I think Max Blumenthal called them out as he was being escorted out of the last State Department briefing, or I guess you could call it his speech. Said he was going to take questions, but as Max pointed out, he was speechifying. Can you talk a little bit about Blinken's connections?
You know, I am not the expert in kind of the personal family tree connections. I know they exist. I know that his stepfather was a very prominent Zionist with ties to other European Israel activists from a long time ago, but I really don't know much more than that. What I do know is that Secretary Blinken has a personal ideological commitment to Zionism. And I think that has impacted his views and his approach to the war in Gaza and the genocide from the get-go. I really truly believe he has blinders on from
I
early
think that's
childhood.
true of Biden too, wouldn't you say?
You know, with Biden, I think it was just political posturing. I don't think it's personal the way it is to Secretary Blinken. This is about family and culture and upbringing, and I know many passionate Zionists, American Zionists, and it means a great deal to them. So I think he is part of that milieu.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about journalists, because we just mentioned Max Blumenthal. Sam Husseini was also carried out of there. He had 4 people on all 4 limbs carrying him out of that room as he was trying to ask his questions, because he had been told by Matt Miller, who Max Blumenthal, I had to laugh. There's nothing funny about any of this, but when he said you're smirking your way through a genocide, I had to laugh because it's so true. I mean, he's literally been doing that. And as he was carried out, he was citing all the questions that he would have asked that Matt Miller told him, I'm not going to call on you. So aside from those 2, Ryan Grimm and the fellow from the AP, I guess his name is Matt Lee.
I know Matt, yeah.
Maybe a couple of others who have been really pressing these guys the whole time. What is your assessment of the performance of the press as far as covering this genocide?
I mean, look at who has been calling out Secretary Blinken. Is one of them from the mainstream media news establishment? I ask you. Is that, I don't want to name names, my friends at the New York Times, is that them standing up in outrage to challenge the lies of Secretary Blinken or the evidence before our faces for the past 14 months? It is a real disappointment, but it is also the reality of mainstream media today, which is under corporate pressures that are very heavy, and, ideological commitments that run through the threads of these mainstream media establishments. There's a lot of sanction if you speak out critically on Israel, and it's going to get worse in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. What about the international community? I mean, it seems like the UN has been calling this out long before even October 7th or October 8th. And the ICJ, of course, had their things that they wanted Israel to do. They were ignored. The ICC has called for arrest warrants on Netanyahu and other officials. They're being ignored. And of course, in the UN, you have the Security Council where the US can veto anything. So do you think there's any possibility? I mean, well, first, how do you feel that the rest of the international community has been standing up for Palestinians? I'll just ask it in 2 parts.
Yeah. Well, I think that the international community at large, the world's public, the people of the world have spoken out in support of Palestinian rights and against Israeli atrocities in a way we haven't seen before, at least not in my generation, not in my memory. And I think that's very significant. I think on top of that, there are a number of governments, more populist governments, governments that do have a lot of popular legitimacy, let's say, who've taken strong stands in support of Palestinian rights. Spain is one of them, surprising. Ireland, because you really have to buck the EU and the diktats of the United States to do that. South Africa is, of course, the state that first brought the lawsuit at the ICJ charging Israel with genocide. These are very bold actions by states of the international community who are going to face tremendous punishment and pushback from the US government for having taken these actions. So I think the international community and the American community has been great in terms of the natural, humane, compassionate response to needing to stop the atrocities. Ceasefire, that's been the call for 14 months. What it has revealed, unfortunately, is that our government uh, does not reflect sort of the will of the people, the majority of Americans who wanted to suspend US military assistance to Israel. No, it's not. And so who is our government acting on behalf of? Why are they taking these decisions in support of atrocities? It shows the lack of democratic process in our own foreign policy. It shows the lack of democratic representation in our foreign policy. It's unacceptable. It's a threat to our own democracy. I really fundamentally believe that.
And it also shows the lack of this particular Secretary of State to use diplomacy. I mean, he never talked to Hamas directly. He never talked to Putin directly. Of all the, secretaries of state I've watched, I think, of course, Kissinger is a war criminal, don't get me wrong, but I actually think that he was a better, more effective Secretary of State in terms of when he wanted to use diplomacy. Do you think that things will be any different with Rubio? I know that things with Trump, because, it can go one of two ways with Trump. On the one hand, we know he wants to get a Nobel Peace Prize for achieving peace in the Middle East. The New York Times did report that a couple of years ago. That's why he sent Jared. Jared came back and said, this Palestinian thing is intractable. We're going to have to leave them out. And Trump said, okay, just do all the other countries, which was one of the reasons I think Hamas did what they did on October 7th. They were being thrown under the bus by all their Arab brethren there. And, Trump feels like he tried to have, it was a little bit ham-handed, but he tried to have, meetings with North Korea and tried to work that situation out. And I feel he's very motivated by his ego, and he's also motivated by his money. Now, Miriam Adelson, on the other hand, gave him $100 million, and she wants them to annex the West Bank, which it looks like they're in the process of doing. I mean, ever since the ceasefire has been, started, they're rounding up people. They're making the apartheid roads even worse than they are. I mean, the settlers are going crazy. So what do you think is going to happen with this new administration? Which way do you think it's going to go for the Palestinians? Better or worse, or just status quo?
We are in the process of doing some scenario planning right now because there's a lot of volatility and a level of volatility with respect to Palestinians that we haven't seen in decades in terms of the any possibility of their survival with any form of self-determination on their own lands. I think there is a very serious prospect that in the next 4 years, Israel will move to annex the West Bank and will try to forcibly displace as many Palestinians out of the West Bank as possible. And I think part of the grand deal that may be cooked up is, a lot of pressure on Jordan to accept Palestinian refugees. Jordan has no financial independence of its own. It's basically a vassal state of Saudi Arabia and the United States. It really has its entire economy operates on charity. And I think that is a very serious possibility. And I think that I have no doubt that there are plans and goals in place to push the Palestinians out of Gaza by forcing Egypt to take some. push Palestinians out of the West Bank into the now increasingly emptied Syrian refugee camps that they built special purpose for Syrian refugees. It's like the space is ready for them. I was just in Jordan last week, and every single Jordanian and Palestinian I spoke to, this is their assessment. This is what they think is imminently going to happen. I spoke to a woman who lives in Ramallah. She's actually an artist. And she just described nightly terror in Ramallah, nightly incursions, nightly attacks, harassment by these vigilante settlers that, maraud in the neighborhoods and terrorize people. And they are really expecting the worst. So that's a scenario. But there are better scenarios. There are more positive scenarios. And I think our job is to come up with the better ones, and try to push civil society to speak more vocally and loudly. If we have any democratic processes in our country, then we should be able to influence what our country does.
Well, that's the problem, because there is this new definition of anti-Semitism that has just been accepted into law. They did it also, a local version. I don't know if it's a model bill, but they did it here in North Carolina. It's called the Shalom Act. And I literally asked Jeff Jackson, who voted for it in Congress, by the way. He went against Jerry Nadler, the highest ranked Jewish person in Congress, telling Democrats to vote present. And I confronted Jackson because he's running for our attorney general. And I asked him why he did that. And then I asked him, if he became attorney general and I spoke out against Israel, was he going to arrest me? And he said, no, he wasn't going to arrest me. The reason he did that was it was one of these cynical ploys that the Republicans do to try to get you on the record, because if you don't vote for it, they call you anti-Semitic. And I knew he was going to say that. So I had my follow-up question, why didn't you vote present like Jerry Nadler said? And then he mumbled something about not being able to defend a present vote when you're actually there, which is BS. But anyway, so we also have the Esther Project, which has been making the rounds. It was part of Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. And it's basically calling all of us part of the Hamas support network, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace or Students for Justice for Palestine. I'm sure your organization is in there also. And not only are we anti-Semitic, we're against capitalism and we're against democracy. I mean, they really threw the book at us. And they have this really detailed plan to take us down, to get us out of the universities, to get us out of media, wherever. And you see that the protests in the first semester were almost non-existent on the campuses. So you say, and I agree with you, that we need to keep resisting, but if you look abroad, they've pretty much beaten down the axis of resistance. They're going to go for the Houthis next. And Iran has been neutered. And this is what they've done to us at home. So where do you see the hope in all this?
That's a tough question. And that's really just about seeing hope and choosing to see hope. Because, I can list all the fatal prognoses, whether it's our environment or the fires in Los Angeles and the rising sea waters and, a whole variety of societal ills. I fundamentally believe that these are man-made policies and man-made problems, and therefore men and women can fix them. And we have to at least try to fix these man-made problems. There are some things that are not in our control, but this is in our control as long as we can. And there are some situations where humanity does come together to stop an atrocity and make a reform and have a change. And we have to believe that that's possible because, it's important for the survival of humanity as a compassionate being around the world. I do find hope because I believe that people want peace and security, and they can be exhausted from fighting, and the fight's not over yet, and I want it to be over very, very soon. But there is a peaceful way to transition to a rights respecting state. That is the book that I am publishing in the spring, along with my colleague Michael Omerman. We don't have a title yet, but it's a blueprint. It's a plan for how Israel can end apartheid and occupation and transition into a rights-respecting state. And we took on this responsibility exactly because of the question you asked me, Lauren, which is where do we find hope? And hope is, responsibility. It's responsibility to carry hope. And this is our proposal for how there can be a civilized, peaceful, honorable transition to peace that, respects the rights and interests and beliefs of all of the peoples between the river and the sea. We believe that it's possible. And that's what the 3-year plan that we've drafted describes in great detail.
Well, I hope when the book comes out, you'll come back on my show to discuss it. In the meantime, what's the next stage of this lawsuit? In your article, you wrote that it's, usually the judiciary doesn't like to get involved in this sort of thing because they see it as in the political realm. So what's the next step? And do you think that the Trump administration and with its judicial appointments that they've already made from the last administration who are in these courts and the ones they're going to make will have an effect on the lawsuit?
Well, we already have a judge. I actually not sure who appointed her, but we have a judge. And the government, I think, has 60 days to reply. Could be 90. I'm not a litigator. And we expect that the government may ask for an extension of time to reply, given the change of administrations. This is handled by the Department of Justice. We expect that they're going to move to dismiss the lawsuit, file a motion to dismiss on jurisdictional grounds, standing, basically procedural issues without even approaching the substance of the claims. And we would file a response to that motion, and the judge would decide if our case can go forward. If we survive that motion to dismiss, if the judge decides that our plaintiffs have standing and they've filed a claim that stands as a matter of law and they've pled sufficient facts to support the violation of the law, then we get discovery. And that really means the start of a lawsuit that probably will take quite a bit of time, but I think that would be a very important hurdle to pass, because then the government has to disclose everything about its processes to avoid enforcing the Leahy Law with respect to Israel.
Well, it should be known that even Patrick Leahy, who wrote the law, did an editorial or I should say an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, I wrote the Leahy Law and it should be applied to Israel. So that's good. I really wish you great success.
Thank you.
The subject of my next show is going to be about a similar lawsuit. I was going to plug it, but since you're still here, I'm going to let you know what it is. The city of Carrboro, North Carolina, has sued Duke Energy for over climate issues. And this is being done in conjunction with the Center for Biological Diversity, which is an organization I fought side by side with in California when we were fighting fracking in that state. And it's going to be the first lawsuit of its time for not following the carbon reduction goals of the state of North Carolina and endangering the residents of Carrboro. And that's just a little town. So I'm thinking that a lot of people are kind of giving up on the legislative process and turning to the courts. And I know that they've had some success in these young people that have been suing on the climate change issue. They so far have been winning on the appeals side, and we'll see where those go. But, I'm going to, again, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to close by telling you the same thing I tell all my audience when I end the show is keep fighting.
All right. Bye.
Bye.